Hi everyone, very nice to be with you. Sorry for this recorded format, but it's be about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning by the time you see this on my side. I'm recording this the Sunday prior, very hot and balmy summer's day here in Sydney, Australia. Everybody's at the beach. I'll see if I finish in time to go down and have a quick swim after. So I'm talking to you today about this idea of design for behavior, something that we're very passionate about. We apply to everything we design in hospitality, and I'm bringing some of our thinking to you, and hopefully it'll be something that you'll find meaningful. So unfortunately today, the majority of interior architecture is designed for the eye of the beholder and not a full positive neuro-aesthetic experience. And it's to this end that its colors, styles and trends that often dominate rather than the myriad of invisible, more elusive, abstract, but I would say more meaningful and more important human behavioral responses, those connections and indeed the disconnections to the built environment. So as old as the discipline of interior architecture and design is, we've had intellectual theories, opinions about our human responses and connections to the built environment, because science was not yet developed enough to give us the facts. Unfortunately, many, if not most of those opinions and theories are debatable. Why? Because our connection to our environment is not really all that logical. In fact, it's quite illogical and irrational. And it's not all that logical for three main reasons. One, our built environment has only been around for about 3 or 4% of our evolutionary Homo sapien development. And the prior 250,000 odd years were spent in nature. Two, everything we interface with today, planes, trains and automobiles, our PC, virtual realities and so forth, has only really been around and pervasive for the last 100 odd years, or perhaps to put it a bit differently, 0.04% of our evolutionary development. And thus, it's way too little time in the expanse of human development for us to have adapted to this very quick change in our environmental development, our environmental surroundings successfully. And lastly, some evolutionary psychologists hold that our hardwiring really in truth stopped to develop by all accounts that matter around 10,000 years ago, due to the fact that all the external environmental pressures that drove this development of our hardwiring stopped at that time, when mass eruptions of volcanoes and mass melting of glaciers were so severe that it changed the weather patterns significantly, and we were forced to develop. And that our hardwiring therefore really has not adapted to the environment that we have around us successfully today. And so there's this axiom that I quite like. You can take the person out of the Stone Age, but not the Stone Age out of the person. So thus we interact with our built environment in very interesting and sometimes very illogical, very irrational ways, but also, fortunately, quite predictable patterns. And it's incumbent upon us as designers to understand what those patterns are, to understand how we behave within space, how it connects with us or disconnects from us, how it influences us, and impacts us in all the ways that really matter if we want to become responsible designers. So it's only really in the 80s that we see the emergence of evidence-based design. And then in early 2000, the emergence of neuroscience, linking up with architecture and leading to a new discipline called Neuro-architecture. Until then, design, as mentioned, was really largely based on, well, learnings, yes, but a lot of the assumptions were opinions, and really just assumptions. And it's the strongest of those that became quite popular. And thus historically we have, for example, powerful axioms such as a house is a machine for living in, and form follows function, where people are in truth ignored, and with mass urbanization during the Industrial Revolution, crowded in very small, functional, inhuman square boxes. And perhaps instead a more responsible axiom would be form follows feeling. And so within design for behavior, we can now factually, through science and psychology, finally know, for example, that ceiling heights do impact our styles of thinking. Low ceilings favor those whose needs are to focus on the details of a subject or matter. By contrast, lofty ceilings are conducive to more abstract styles of thinking, brainstorming and creative solutions. That nature makes a massive contribution to our health and actually does help us to heal a lot quicker, hence the increase now of biophilia in hospitals, and that we have a specific relationship with color. But this color brought about by our evolutionary association with color in food does not in fact translate to the same psychological association with color in, say, interior spaces or indeed in restaurant spaces as has been thought for so long. So let's kick this off with a story. It's a story of Filippo Tommaso Marinetti. On the 15th of November 1930, he presents a manifesto to his fellow Italians calling for a ban on pasta, describing it as an absurd Italian gastronomic religion. It deludes people into thinking it's nutritious, he says, makes them lazy, tradition-bound and pacifist, preventing them from achieving any kind of greatness. He is met with massive protest. Petitions are signed, housewife takes to the streets, and an enraged Italian journalist challenges Marinetti to a duel which he foolishly accepts and loses. He is gravely injured. 2 years later, perhaps having learned a valuable lesson in his future's cookbook, A Tactile Dinner Party, he suggests a more wholesome idea. A restaurant where guests can engage in all their senses whilst dining. They would be dressed in pajamas made of various materials such as sponge, cork, sandpaper, felt, aluminium, bristles, cardboard, velvet, so forth. And they would be led into a dark room where they'd have to choose their dinner partners according to their tactile preferences. There'd be no cutlery, and they would have to eat with their hands. Now that conceptual thinking was certainly way ahead of its time, and it would take decades for retailers and restaurateurs to catch up onto some of this thinking. And it's in fact, when Hester Blumenthal at the Fat Duck famously asked designers to don headphones and listen to the sound of the sea while eating an oyster, it would be more than 80 years later. So within design, but I would say even more specifically within restaurant design and hospitality design, it's very important for us to design for all our senses. Now we have 5 basic human senses. They're familiar to most, like touch, sight, sound, smell, and taste. But however, we also have a remarkable 6th and 7th sense, namely proprioception and interoception, that is not that well known, often spoke about. But let's get right into it. So, sight. This is by far our strongest sense. It has a massive impact on our other senses and also the biggest impact on the emotions that we experience. If we therefore don't like what we see, the chances are that it will have a very big negative domino effect on all our other senses and our emotions, especially our sense of taste, as taste, conversely, is our weakest of our senses, and thus very easily influenced by what we see. Now think about designing for your audience. You have to understand who your audience would be. They're not everybody. You have a bullseye audience, a subset. They have a certain relationship with visual references, and if you need to understand what those are to design for that audience so that they can find your restaurant visually relatable. If they find that relatable and connect to that, the chances are far bigger that they would connect to the food served inside it. Sound. Acoustic control is vital. If diners cannot hear each other over dinner, well, they resort to raising their voices, and that raises noise levels even further, and then other people raise their voices, they can't hear, and so it becomes this crescendo. This is called the Lombard effect. And because people dine out to socialize, the ability to be able to converse easily cannot be overvalued. Light loud noise incidentally detracts diners from smelling and tasting their food. Think about the term aeroplane food. American researchers have found that it's the constant high frequency of that noise of the motors that significantly alters our perception of our taste, preventing us from enjoying the food in the way we would normally do. So it doesn't matter if that same food is served, or the incredible food in a restaurant is served up there, the sense of taste would always be different. And that being said, noise is also the second most common complaint after poor service in restaurants, in fact, outstripping the complaint on food. Smell. Now, this is the most primal of our senses and is developed through thousands of years to collect data from our surroundings. We have, in fact, 400 smelling receptors. So when we're hungry, our bodies boost the reception of our sense of smell in order to help us find food, evolutionary development, of course. So apart from the theater and the sense of trust an open kitchen brings, it's also open to allow the sense of smell of food to travel right through the space to where you sit, to increase your sense of hunger and your sense of wanting. So incidentally, the correct smell can increase restaurant turnovers by up to 300% and average stay by up to 16%. Touch. Now that's, interestingly enough, the very first sense that humans develop. Pressure, temperature, light, vibration, and pain. Now we have the saying that the weight of the chair equals the length of the stay based on this. Why we say this is that the weight and texture of the chair and menu, cutlery, for example, in a restaurant should be in line with the category of restaurant. For instance, have you ever noticed that a fast food establishment, they have smooth finishes? The menus are light, the chairs are light, they slide in and out easily. Fine dining, on the opposite spectrum, have textured finishes. The chairs are heavy, cutlery is heavy, menu is heavy, chairs are heavy. You sit in a far more comfortable environment, and that's in line with your expectation of the place. You know, when you go to fine dining, you go for a long visit. When you go to fast food, you go for a quick visit, and therefore everything needs to relate to that expectation. Taste, as pointed out in the beginning, is our weaker sense, highly impacted by what we see. Additionally, the memory of taste is also highly impacted by what we feel. In a fascinating study in 2014 by the University of Haifa in Israel, they discovered a connection between the region of our brain responsible for taste, the taste cortex, and the area encoding the time and place of the food taste experience, the hippocampus. The conclusion was that people have an illusion of taste memory, and that if the experience was not memorable in its totality, the chances would be that you would not remember the taste of the food either. Now think about this for yourself. Try this experiment. Think about your best food memories. They are almost always related to an experience where the time and place and people you were with take precedent over the food. The day you shared a pizza with your partner in a little quaint Italian restaurant or village, a rooftop sunset barbecue with your best mates when you won the game. None of the stories would be isolated to a food item only. They will almost always be about an experience with someone in a special place where a memory was created. Proprioception deals with how our brains understand where our bodies and body parts are in relation to space, in relation to each other. Your ability to touch your nose when your eyes are closed without poking out your eye. The receptor responsible for this, called the piezo-2, piezo in Greek is to press, was only discovered as late as 2009, and as late as 2015, scientists were just starting to figure out what piezo-2 did in mice, let alone what it did in humans. So there's a lot of discovery to be done there still. Now, proprioception sensory information really comes primarily from special receptors in our muscles and in our joints. And interoception is the feeling of knowing what's happening inside our body, knowing our heartbeats, feeling of hunger, of thirst, of cold. Those are basic examples. It's core in guiding us how we feel in a space, the atmosphere we're experiencing, crucially in guiding us through our bodily experiences in a restaurant, such as feeling comfortable or uncomfortable in our seats, and experiencing the appropriate temperature and the appropriate lighting. Now, proprioception and interoception is active every time you get in and out of a chair or navigate your way around the cockpit of a car or a room, and it's therefore vital in spatial intelligent design and our bodily experience and connection to a space. So on a practical level, think about climbing stairs. You don't have to look at each stair whilst climbing. It's your sense of your body and your feet relative to the height of the rise is almost automatic. It only becomes a problem when a step within a series of steps is higher or lower or even longer than the rest, causing you to fall. And interestingly enough, people tend to stumble over one step more frequently than they do over two. That's proprioception and interoception. So apart from the role our senses play in the way we experience space, we also have a host of set patterns, set perceptions with which we engage with space due to our evolutionary development, or perhaps the shortcomings also in our evolution, as mentioned earlier. But for the purpose of this brief talk, I'm going to take one part. We'll focus specifically on the 8 patterns of seating based on our ingrained human needs, specifically in restaurants. Social spaces like restaurants need to be designed exactly in line with how people behave and react comfortably to specific spatial typologies. So through trial and error, observing security footage, just observing space, what we've done, spending time in it over 30 years, we've distilled 8 behavioral biases into these 8 seating principles that I will now share with you. The first is the broad basic idea of huddling. Now, for the most part, people like busy restaurants, as restaurants are social spaces and people are social beings, and we go primarily to a restaurant to be sociable. Restaurants are therefore often busy because they're busy. It's that wonderful circularity that they're busy because they're busy. People will almost always choose the busiest restaurant. Given the choice, if there were 2 neighboring ones and the one had a queue and the other one did not, they would choose the one with the queue because it has the social proof of a queue. The other one does not have the social proof of a queue, even though it may be as good or even better. That's a bias called herding. Now, once you've been to that restaurant once or twice, you also have this concept of self-herding, where you now mentally queue behind yourself because you've been there before. To this end, finding suitable layout that puts your people in a restaurant on display is far more important than putting food on display, for example. Then we have this idea of framing. Now, our observations and studies show that most people tend to frame a space on the outer edges first before they move towards the center. But that's not all. That people tend to gravitate towards the corners first before they fill out the rest of the edges. So why does this happen? Well, this is due to our natural instinct to seek a sense of security and comfort by having a protective wall or corner behind our back from where we can have a physical advantage over the rest of the people and our ability to see the rest of the space. This framing behavior we see gets to about 50 or 70% before people start moving towards the inner core. Now that's of course design dependent. If you design special, more protected spaces further in the restaurant, people will go to them as well. We'll get to that. Then we have the lookout. Seating with views attract people even if comfort and position is compromised. For instance, a good view from an external table, even in cold weather, would be favored over more comfortable internal temperature controlled seating without a view. And additionally, seating, obviously depending on the measure of cold or hot. Additionally, seating internally in a cramped space with a view will most often be favored over more comfortable seating without a view. Again, this is an evolutionary survival bias or instinct to see oncoming danger before it gets to us. And then we have perching. Compromised areas, for example, those at the deepest end of a restaurant, can be solved by just raising it significantly over the rest of the space, as people naturally and instinctively prefer elevated areas and will seek out higher ground. Now, to make perching even more effective, it's important to consider the height of the elevated area. For example, 1 step's not going to count. It doesn't make any difference. It needs to be 2 steps or 3 or 4. Now 1 step also has this problem that we actually tend to trip over it. People don't notice it. They notice 2 or more. So that's also another reason. And 2 steps kind of makes it a more conscious, deliberate, and intentional choice, whereas we said a kind of single step probably go unnoticed. And then we have this principle we call the sunflower. People are drawn to the sun or natural light, even if these are not exposed to a view. Regardless of modern innovations, humans are still biological and psychologically programmed to benefit from natural light. And of course, natural light provides warmth, comfort, safety, and energy, and helps our bodies produce vitamin D, improves our circadian rhythms, and most of all, it increases our sense of joy, and it helps us to focus. Now, as we spend 90% of our time indoors, any form of natural light in a restaurant is a massive source of attraction. Then we have this concept we call borrowing. Everyone has their reasons for seeking privacy, of course. It's no different when it comes to dining out. It may be a romantic date, a private function, a meeting, or a well-known person that needs privacy. So booking a private room also gives us a sense of achievement, this expectation that one will receive better personal service, and the sense of significance. Now, but these borrows are typically found in very negative leftover nooks and crannies, such as alcoves, corners, or spaces with no windows right in the back that we would typically reserve, say, for storage that produces no income. Now, if you can convert that into a borrow, that's an clever application of turning a negative space into a positive space, and massive contribution to the financial game, and a financial game changer for restaurants. As you know, restaurants, every single seat that can create turnover really counts. Then you have this idea of cocooning. People are naturally drawn towards in-between spaces for reasons mentioned, offer a sense of protection and comfort. Like think of a cozy nook in a library, or snuggling up under a warm blanket on a cold day. And think of our children. They seek out these small spaces, like the space under tables, inside a cardboard box, or inside a blanket tent. And adults, we retain this childlike instinct to cocoon. We naturally feel more in control in these environments as opposed to very large, open, cavernous spaces. So, like on that picture, that's a space we did in Adelaide, creating these kind of spaces that you can still sit inside, but have a sense of your surroundings, sense of privacy, sense of cocooning. They are extremely popular. And then we have the 8th one, the sense of people gazing. People love to sit facing a busy street or facing pedestrians, even when the view beyond this is not that great. Even single lines of seating in an alley with high foot traffic, or sets of tables in a very noisy intersection, is often preferred. Why is that? Because, as we alluded to in our opening paragraph, what attracts people most to restaurants are other people. So this crowded, noisy space is also where single people prefer to sit, because they can kind of blend in and not be obvious. And we also have this neuron called a mirror neuron, where we learn by copying. It's one of the strongest senses to learn. From when we're a child, we copy. We also copy and when we're adults, by observing people, even though this may be quite subconscious, like their mannerisms, the way they may hold a knife and fork, the way they speak, the way they dress. We learn through that constantly. So people watching, people gazing is a very strong motivator. So that really brings us quite fast, it feels, but it's a very small slot to speak, to this conclusion. And this is that the principle of all of this is that we can, in fact, pre-design certain exact spatial design typologies towards certain exact human biases and needs, and bank these for future use in order to speed up the process of design, as in truth, commercial design really needs. Things in commercial space happen so fast. So it helps us to get the bones right, as it were. And the rest of our time can then effectively be used to skin the space in a relatable idea, story, or style, or a concept. It doesn't, however, start with the skin, and unfortunately it's the skin-deep design approach that is flaming the disconnect of people to time and place, and the problem with so much of design today. So I'm leaving you with this final thought. The word restaurant is a French verb borrowed from a Latin word, restaurer, meaning to restore or to renew. So restaurant designers, you're responsible, therefore, in every way that really matters, other than the food and other than simple appearances. You have to engage all the senses and trigger all the correct emotional behavioral responses in all the ways that truly matter to tie people to the moments, the space, and the people, and above all, to rejuvenate and to restore. Thank you. I hope there were some learnings in there, and I really hope that I can be with you live in a next event. Thank you so much for your time.